Morning, guys. Talking about the Formula 1 news. Mercedes have finally confirmed the future of George Russell and Kimi Antonelli, but under what conditions? Rumour has it George Russell has secured a multi-year deal with the team. Some say that secures his future with Mercedes long beyond 2026 into 27 and beyond. Others, though, are far from convinced that's what's happening, and with Mercedes refusing to comment on the matter and saying anything about 2027, the rumours around Max Verstappen, if anything, are greater than ever. Very much enjoyed your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new, as always. Plenty to get into today. We're going to start right here. I know this won't be the cup of tea for everyone, but I just thought it was funny that we're going this way. Grid gigs. Not grid girls. Grid girls aren't back. We've got grid gigs, and it's starting in the US Grand Prix this weekend. It's then going to continue in Las Vegas. Effectively, the idea is that before the Grand Prix starts, presumably like, I don't know, along the grid or something, they're going to have a festival-type performance-type concert thing. It's going to be like a halftime show at the Super Bowl, probably, before everything gets underway. Country singer Drake Milligan's going to do it this weekend. Look, it might be great, I don't know. I just thought I'd point it out. That's the direction we continue to move in. Couple of quick things at McLaren. We know that Piastri versus Norris should continue to be a key talking point of the weekend, and maybe will become the main one depending on what happens. Mario Andretti, who's now increasingly involved again in Formula 1 with a Cadillac project, says this: I like Piastri, Lando is also good, but Piastri is calmer and takes a more calculated approach. It seems like McLaren supports Lando more. I don't know why. And I thought this was a pretty fascinating thing for him to say. We know that Zach Brown the other day said it was ludicrous to suggest that any type of these things are happening, but it's always interesting when someone so integral to Formula 1 like Mario Andretti is saying something like this publicly, whether you agree with him or not. This was some of the drama that Zach Brown responded to with this Alex Palou lawsuit over the last couple of days. But another very interesting development of the Palou McLaren lawsuit is some reveal in terms of how McLaren actually get their drivers in for free practice sessions and elsewhere. Now, this shouldn't come as a massive surprise. We know that getting into racing, motorsport, F1 is expensive, and if you want to do it at a high level, you've got to have a lot of backing, right? It's known that, drivers like Lando Norris, if his father wasn't worth a lot of money and didn't have a lot of money to commit to Lando's, let's say, seat and security within McLaren, that may not have happened. Now, of course, is Lando good enough to absolutely deserve where he is? Sure. It doesn't mean that you don't need money to be able to earn your right to that seat, as it were. So Zach Brown says that, yeah, Lando paid to be part of the F1 team until he got fully promoted in 2019, even talking about how testing and free practice sessions are effectively paid for. This is something which isn't massively commonly talked about. I know that Jeppe did a little piece on this and says this shouldn't be a big surprise. To put this into context, Williams was kept afloat selling seats. Sauber's pre-Audi business was built on selling seats. It wasn't long ago that, paid drivers were absolutely the norm. Haas survived the rich energy fiasco by selling seats. Mercedes, Ferrari, Alpine buy seat to smaller teams. Red Bull bought a whole team. It's known that people do this, I suppose, but it is very fascinating that the rumours emerging today, it's not even a rumour, I think this is straight up said in the Alex Palou McLaren case, that Ryo Hirakawa, who drove in some testing previous cars and did free practice one in Abu Dhabi 2024, paid 3.5, maybe he didn't personally pay, I don't know, but his backers paid $3.5 million to get that deal done, which is kind of wild. You'd like to think that these free practice sessions were based on merit and putting the driver who most deserves it or has the richest future in the car. That is not always the case by any means. So a little bit of drama to open up the day. This was going to be my main talking point, actually, until the George Russell news was announced on the Mercedes engine for next year. So Carlos Sainz says that he's excited about the positive news around the engine. The reality is that, yeah, maybe the Mercedes engine is pretty godlike, but you've got McLaren and Mercedes also using it, right? So Williams have to get past them, and Alpine as well, who are switching to Mercedes power next year. But it was an interesting development on what the pecking order of the engine engines might currently be. There's been a fair bit of talk about Honda being potentially quite close to where Mercedes are. Again, there will continue to be talk about fuel and how the new e-fuels are relevant, let's say, to the performance of the engines. But look, if Honda have a good engine, it might not be spectacular, but if it's good enough, maybe Newey and the team can work a bit of a masterclass. There's talk that Honda might be in the mix all of a sudden, because for some time we really had no idea what Honda were cooking for their 2026 engine. But we actually have some figures, and this kind of came out of nowhere really, but this article from Motorsport Italia talked about Audi as well, because Audi pretty much said their engine's cooked. They've actually taken a very pessimistic approach, and Mattia Binotto's been like, well, next year's engine's not going to be ideal. Now, where they will end up, that's a good question. Rumour has it, these are what the numbers look like, right? And the article actually describes a couple of numbers with respect to Audi's engine and then also where Mercedes are. So we do talk a fair bit about the rumours about the engines. Red Bull the other day said that it's very, very promising what they're cooking up with respect to presumably their internal benchmarks. But what are the benchmarks of the other teams? So we never really know, and it's all a little bit subjective. And this is still subjective, and this is according to sources, but it's still interesting that, according to rumours, the Germans, this is Audi, not Mercedes, have broken through the 400 kilowatt barrier. So worth keeping in mind, this is for the combustion side of the engine, which will be equivalent to roughly 55% of the total horsepower will come from combustion, and the other 45% will come from the electrical components. As we know, both are going to be incredibly important, but if you get it right on the combustion side, then obviously it's going to make your life somewhat easier. Arguably, the integration there between the two and the electrical side is maybe more of the technical challenge, and I would expect there to be pretty big differences in performance next year. But what's interesting is not necessarily that Audi might be close, but more so what the benchmark is, right? So apparently the Germans, Audi, have got to 400 kilowatts on their internal combustion engine. That's 540, 550 horsepower. Apparently the Mercedes power unit is credited as having 420 kilowatts, approximately 571 horsepower. So, you know, that would be a handful more. We believe that the current Alpine power unit has well, at least they say, it has a 30 horsepower deficit to its rivals, but that's across the current ICE, which is about 850 horsepower, and the electrical side, which another 150 roughly. So, you know, on the 1,000 horsepower scale, we think that Alpine might be 30 or so behind, to roughly 3% behind the curve. This would be more than 3% behind the curve because we're talking about lower numbers, but it's still not a million miles away. I think that's what I find interesting, though, is that this apparently is the number. That's where Mercedes are, because we understand that 55% roughly of the power will come from ICE, so we were kind of thinking about 1,000 horsepower, expecting maybe 550 horsepower or so from the ICE. Mercedes apparently are kicking out about 571, so that is considered to be the benchmark on the combustion side, but as I say, arguably the combustion side, that's the easier part of the equation, right? Like, that's the part where maybe you should be closer. The real challenge is probably the electrical side and certainly the integration between the two. So, intrigued to your thoughts on that in the comments. As I say, it was going to be a key talking point of today, and it still is. But the idea that Mercedes are considered to be ahead, but if Audi are reasonably close, it stands to reason that the other teams are not going to be a million miles away either. Of course, when we get to the track, reliability is also going to be a key point of concern. Couple of quick responses from Ferrari, because they've been under so much pressure again from the media over the last few days. Vasseur says the team is united and fully determined to change course, but he also says the rumours are mega negative for us. I know that we have to work with the pressure and we have to deal with pressure. It's the DNA of our sport, but I think you have enough pressure on track to not get pressure at home. We know that we need to deliver. We need to get results. So, and look, his own organisation has also added to the pressure, right? John Alcan Benedetta Vigna the other day said, we will win, we absolutely will win, we will win for the Tifosi, or whatever they described it as. So, look, they're putting the pressure on themselves. We know that the media has been talking a lot about Horner, a lot about Vasseur getting the sack and all this over the last few days. Look, the Italian press back at home for Ferrari never help matters precisely. but it is an inevitability. What are you going to do about it, right? If you're Ferrari, if you're winning, they love it, right? So it kind of goes both ways, and they'll give you a bit more leeway. There's also been a lot of talk about next year's engine, right? Because with Wolff Zimmermann stepping away, I think Audi have picked him up going forwards. Apparently, they've abandoned Zimmermann's innovative steel cylinder head design due to reliability issues, and that's led to an aluminium solution featuring a revolutionary and secret intake system. Now, this does mean that they're playing catch-up. So I don't know, how the validity of this is, but it's interesting. We talk about the engines. Enrico Gualtieri, who's kind of leading things up over there at Ferrari with his technical team, they are apparently playing catch-up to Mercedes, with Honda not far behind. So some say that Honda might be second, some say that it's Mercedes, Ferrari, then Honda, and actually there were reliability issues with the previous version. Now they're trying to iron those out. They've got a few months to make it really work, and if they've got a revolutionary and secret intake system that the other teams haven't thought of, look, maybe it's Ferrari's year after all, but I wouldn't put too much hope on that. Charles Leclerc, pretty funny. He needs to win every race and sprint from now to the end of the year. He needs Piastri and Norris to basically not score another point if he wants to somehow win this championship. But this was posted yesterday that Leclerc is still technically in the fight, and he actually commented on it and said, "Let's go, this is the weekend." Someone who is also still in the fight is George Russell. Technically, we know it's not going to happen, but he has finally been confirmed today as a Mercedes driver for next year alongside Antonelli. So they were probably always going to do this at the same time. Mercedes delighted to confirm George Russell and Kimi Antonelli will continue as the team's driver lineup in 2026. This, of course, was coming. This is what they have to say. George and Kimi have proved a strong pairing. We're excited to continue the journey. Confirming our driver lineup was always a matter of when, not if. And, well, what they describe is pretty interesting because Mercedes don't say that much, which is controversial maybe. Confirming our driver lineup, we wanted to take our time, handle the negotiations properly, and make sure everyone on all sides was happy. I'm pleased that we have done that. How happy are all the parties? That's a good question. Not everyone's ever going to be delighted. At the end of the day, when there's negotiations, you can both be satisfied and happy, but you'll always feel like you could have got a bit more, right? If you're a driver, you could have had a higher salary. If you're a team, you could have had slightly more leeway. But if you're a driver, you could have had fewer sponsorship obligations. You could have had more protection, more security in terms of a longer-term deal. So I'm not saying that Toto is lying, right? Like, I wouldn't be surprised if the drivers are happy with what they've eventually decided, but maybe not as happy as they could have been. And Toto says, I'm pleased that we've done that. George and Kimi have been a strong pairing, excited to continue that together. We've now got 6 more races to go. George says, I'm proud to continue our journey together. It'll be my 10th year since I signed with Mercedes. Long and successful partnership. We're focused on making next year the best it can possibly be. And, I would be surprised if George isn't in the mix next year for the World Drivers' Championship. And Mercedes should be in the mix for the constructors, you would think, as well. Antonelli, I think, has done a perfectly fine job this season. I think, given expectations as a rookie, he's actually done all right. I mean, he's had his ups, he's certainly had his downs. I don't think he's been terrible. He doesn't look great in comparison to the other rookies who have done a sensational job, right? Like, I think Behrman's been brilliant. Hadjar's obviously been spectacular. Bortoletto has really turned heads as well. So Antonelli, as a consequence, has not been considered to be that good. And I do get that, right? But at the same time, I think his ups have still been pretty solid. And I think he's shown enough. He's not exceeded my expectations, but I think he's been about where I thought that he might be. And as a rookie into a top team, right, on paper, in a car that should be competing further up the order, I think he's done a reasonable job and certainly deserves to stay. But I think you could argue that if Kimi doesn't really kick on next year, then if Verstappen is an option, maybe it's Kimi who goes, not George. I think that's a conversation that will still be had. So that's pretty much all Mercedes say. Toto says wanted to take our time. But the question for many is, what is this deal? Because Mercedes didn't say, right? I mean, you look at the article here. They confirmed that they're driving for them next year, will continue as the team's driver lineup. Usually, they like to say multi-year deal, right? That the teams usually say this. They won't say when until, but they like to say multi-year deal. They've not said anything about multi-year deal. And that's very interesting to me because according to rumours, it is a multi-year deal, but Mercedes haven't said it, which is kind of strange, because if it is indeed a multi-year deal, you'd have thought that they might have been very open about that, because it shows commitment to George, right, and to Kimi, who knows about the future. Again, most of the discussion here will be about George, or should George be concerned? What's George's contract? But also, what is it for Kimi, right? Like, is there some sort of contract between the both of them? If George outperforms Kimi by a certain amount, he's safe and Kimi isn't, or the other way around, who knows? We don't know. But again, it's like Antonelli for next year, for 2027, yes, he is, of course, the long-term intention for Mercedes. But also, if George Russell is your current real contender, then it does become an interesting discussion, because at some point Mercedes, if they do really want Max, may have to make a decision as to whether they feel that George is better than Kimi will ever be, or whether by the time Kimi gets as good as they think he can be, whether it's going to be too late, or, they'll have missed George's prime. Whatever the debate is, I don't think this is as simple as like, oh, Russell's got this deal or Russell hasn't. The Antonelli piece is also not one that's worth putting to bed entirely. But Duquesa says it's a multi-year deal. We then get the race saying, John Noble says as well in another tweet, it's a multi-year deal. So it's understood it's a multi-year deal. This is an article here from the New York Times, The Athletic. They say this, with sources with knowledge of the matter, speaking on condition of anonymity, have indicated to The Athletic that Russell has signed a multi-year deal securing his long-term future with Mercedes. And this is the additional kind of clause that I thought was worth mentioning, because a multi-year deal can be a 1+1, right? Because it's multiple years. But of course, who decides the +1? Is it Mercedes? Is there some sort of performance clause on both sides? What does that look like? There was a recent rumour that George had got a clause in there into the contract whereby if he outperformed Kimi by a certain amount, his contract would automatically be extended for 2027. That is not totally implausible. But a 1+1 is fundamentally quite fickle, right? Whereas for The Athletic to say that it secures his long-term future, that would imply more like a 2+1 or a 2-year deal or something like that, right? Because a 1+1 doesn't really secure his long-term future. So no one is saying what the terms of this multi-year deal are. Some are saying it's a multi-year deal, which says to me 1+1, especially with Mercedes not saying anything. But this from The Athletic kind of implies that it might be more secure than that. I mean, they literally say it secures his future. But again, maybe that's just because technically 2 years is long term, I guess, depending on your opinion. The bottom line is, George has a contract which he's at least happy enough with to sign. We understand that he was probably pushing for fewer sponsorship days, probably for more money. Maybe realising that Toto wasn't going to budge on the 1+1 thing is very plausible. And again, the fact that Mercedes haven't said anything about a long-term deal does make you wonder, because yeah, it might be a multi-year deal. That's what everyone is telling us. All the sources are saying it's multi-year, so why haven't Mercedes said it? Good question. What does that mean for Max Verstappen, right? Because it's funny how on the day when Russell and Antonelli have finally been confirmed, you might have thought that would put a load of the rumours to bed. But if anything, it's kind of done the opposite, because people are now wondering, well, hang on a second here, why has Toto not said what he could have said? Why is the door still very much left ajar, right? Mercedes mention nowhere in here about 2027, right? It's all about 2026, what's happened in the past, and what's going to happen in the future. So it's very clear that 2027 is still potentially a very different story indeed. But look, George Russell absolutely deserved the contract. Look, there's a world where George Russell wins next year's World Championship, right? I think if Mercedes have the car, if Mercedes have a better car than anybody else, Russell will be the favourite. I think he can do it with the machinery. And if, in a hypothetical world, Russell wins next year's championship, can you drop him, right? You're going to drop him for Max after, like, just hypothetically, right? That's just not going to happen, is it? So I think that's what, there must be something in that in the contract, right? Where George, because I think George can be confident that if Mercedes give him the car next year, he can be a contender, if not look to win the whole thing. Surely George has got some sort of clause in there that says, look, if I do this well with respect to Kimi, or if I do this well with respect to the rivals, then you extend the contract automatically. I wouldn't be surprised if that's what's going on, because at the end of the day, Mercedes just want to win championships again, and if they can do that next year with George, they wouldn't need Max, theoretically. But anyway, tweet your thoughts in the comments. This is what the driver lineups look like for next year. Of course, 22 on the grid next year, with Bottas and Perez joining with Cadillac. There's 4 seats up for grabs, and we pretty much know what's going to happen, we think. Current rumour is that Max will be partnered with Isaac Hadjar at Red Bull Racing. The Racing Bulls will have Lawson and quite possibly Lindblad's getting promoted from Formula 2. Maybe Yuki could stay, but probably kind of unlikely. And then Gasly could get Yuki, but we think more likely Colapinto gets an extension there. So very much enjoyed your thoughts on all this stuff in the comments. Just one final thing to close out the video that was funny. This is Mohammed Ben Sulayem having a meeting yesterday with 2 very familiar faces. So very much enjoyed your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoyed. Subscribe if you're new. Take care, and I'll see you next time.